Imagine a bird so unique that it seems almost impossible it ever survived in the wild. It cannot fly despite being a parrot. It is active almost entirely at night. It weighs as much as a small house cat, climbs trees using its powerful claws, and walks across the forest floor with surprising confidence. Its soft green feathers blend perfectly with moss and ferns, making it nearly invisible among New Zealand's ancient forests. For millions of years, these remarkable traits made it one of nature's greatest success stories. Then, almost overnight, in evolutionary terms, those same adaptations pushed the species to the edge of extinction. This is the story of the kākāpō, one of the world's rarest birds and the heaviest parrot on Earth. More importantly, it is the story of one of the most ambitious wildlife rescue missions ever attempted. In the mid-1990s, conservationists faced a heartbreaking reality. Only 51 known kākāpōs remained alive. Every individual bird mattered. Losing even one could erase precious genetic diversity forever. With no time left to waste, experts made a bold decision. They would move every surviving bird to carefully selected predator-free islands, and hope nature would do the rest. At first, the plan seemed almost perfect. The islands were cleared of invasive predators, strict biosecurity rules protected every landing site, and conservation workers monitored each bird around the clock. If predators had been the main problem, removing them should have allowed the population to recover quickly. But years passed, and the miracle everyone expected never came. The kākāpōs survived, yet they barely reproduced. Healthy adults wandered through lush forests, food was plentiful, and predators were absent. Still, breeding seasons produced disappointingly few chicks. Scientists found themselves asking an uncomfortable question. Had they saved the birds from extinction, only to discover that the species no longer knew how to recover? To understand why this happened, we have to travel back millions of years. New Zealand evolved unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. After separating from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, the islands developed in extraordinary isolation. Unlike most continents, New Zealand had virtually no native land mammals hunting across its forests. There were no foxes, wolves, wildcats, or weasels stalking prey beneath the trees. Instead, birds filled ecological roles that mammals occupied elsewhere. The kākāpō evolved in this peaceful world. Because no fast-running predators chased it, flight gradually became unnecessary. Flying requires enormous amounts of energy, and over countless generations, natural selection favored birds that invested that energy elsewhere. The kākāpō became larger, heavier, and stronger. Its wings remained, but they could no longer lift its growing body into sustained flight. Instead of escaping danger by flying away, the kākāpō relied on camouflage. When threatened, it often froze completely, trusting its moss-green feathers to hide it from predators searching by sight. Against birds of prey soaring overhead, this strategy worked brilliantly. Remaining perfectly still often meant remaining completely invisible. For millions of years, nothing challenged that strategy. Then humans arrived in New Zealand roughly 700 to 800 years ago. The first Polynesian settlers brought the kior, or Pacific rat. Centuries later, European settlement introduced cats, stoats, ferrets, and other mammalian predators unlike anything the kākāpō had ever encountered. These hunters relied heavily on smell rather than sight. Suddenly, remaining motionless no longer offered protection. In fact, it made escape almost impossible. The kākāpō's natural scent, often described by researchers as sweet or slightly musky, became easy for predators to follow through dense forests. Instead of hiding, the birds unknowingly revealed their location. Generation after generation disappeared. By the 20th century, kākāpōs had vanished from most of New Zealand. Scientists feared the species might already be beyond saving. Then, against incredible odds, isolated populations were discovered deep within some of the country's most remote wilderness. These survivors represented the last hope for an entire species. But saving them would require a rescue operation unlike anything conservationists had attempted before. And even after every surviving bird reached safety, the greatest challenge was still waiting. By the early 1990s, New Zealand's conservation community understood that simply protecting the remaining kākāpōs where they lived was no longer enough. Even in remote forests, introduced predators continued to pose a deadly threat. Every breeding season became a race against time, and every missing bird represented another step toward extinction. The numbers were terrifying. Only 51 known kākāpōs remained alive. Some were old, others had never successfully raised chicks, and the entire species depended on a tiny population with extremely limited genetic diversity. If disease, predators, or a natural disaster struck, there might never be another chance. The Department of Conservation decided to attempt something unprecedented. Every surviving kākāpō would be carefully captured and relocated to offshore islands where introduced predators had been completely removed. These islands would become living sanctuaries, giving the birds a chance to recover without the constant danger that had haunted them for centuries. The operation required months of planning. Kakapos are not easy birds to find. They spend daylight hours hidden beneath dense vegetation or inside natural shelters, becoming active only after sunset. Conservation teams worked long nights, following radio transmitters attached to each bird. Once located, every kākāpō received a thorough health examination before being prepared for transport. Helicopters became an essential part of the rescue. Many birds lived in rugged mountain valleys where no roads existed. Rangers carefully placed each kākāpō inside specially designed transport boxes before flying them across New Zealand's dramatic landscape toward predator-free islands such as Codfish Island, Whenuaho, and Anchor Island. For many conservationists, it was an emotional moment. They knew they were carrying the future of an entire species inside those helicopters. If the rescue failed, the kākāpō might disappear forever. The islands themselves had undergone years of preparation before the first bird arrived. Introduced rats, cats, and other predators had been eradicated through extensive conservation programs. Strict biosecurity measures were introduced to prevent new invasions. Every boat, helicopter, backpack, and supply crate entering the islands had to be carefully inspected. Even a single pregnant rat could undo decades of work. Visitors followed strict quarantine procedures. Boots were cleaned. Equipment was disinfected. Food supplies were carefully sealed. Nothing was left to chance. Once released into their new homes, the kākāpōs appeared to adapt surprisingly well. They explored the forests. They climbed native trees. They fed on leaves, shoots, fruits, and seeds exactly as they had for thousands of years. For the first time in centuries, they lived without fear of cats or stoats silently hunting them through the night. Conservationists felt hopeful. Surely, this was the turning point. The birds were finally safe. Yet the years that followed brought an unexpected disappointment. Despite abundant food and ideal habitat, breeding remained incredibly rare. Some seasons passed without a single successful nest. Others produced only 1 or 2 surviving chicks. Considering the tiny population, these numbers were nowhere near enough to guarantee recovery. Scientists checked everything they could think of. Were the birds unhealthy? No. Veterinary examinations showed most adults were in remarkably good condition. Was there enough food? Absolutely. The islands contained healthy native forests, and conservation teams even provided carefully prepared supplemental food to ensure no bird went hungry. Were predators somehow returning? Again, the answer was no. Monitoring confirmed the islands remained free of the invasive mammals that had devastated the species for generations. Everything seemed perfect. Yet the kākāpōs simply refused to breed consistently. For conservation workers who had devoted years of their lives to saving these birds, the situation became deeply frustrating. They had removed the greatest threat. They had created the safest habitat imaginable. Still, the recovery stalled. It slowly became clear that eliminating predators was only the first step. The real challenge lay hidden inside the kākāpō's own biology. Something deep within the species determined exactly when reproduction could happen. And until scientists discovered that hidden trigger, no amount of human effort would convince the birds otherwise. The answer, when it finally emerged, came not from the birds themselves, but from a native New Zealand tree that had been quietly controlling their lives all along. For years, conservationists believed they had overlooked something obvious. If the kākāpōs were healthy, protected, and well-fed, why weren't they producing enough chicks? Every nesting season brought the same disappointment. A few birds attempted to breed, but many did not. The population increased so slowly that experts worried time was running out. The answer eventually came from careful observation rather than dramatic discovery. Researchers noticed an unusual pattern. Whenever the kākāpōs experienced a successful breeding season, another event had occurred at exactly the same time. Across their forest habitat, one particular native tree had produced an unusually heavy crop of fruit. That tree was the rimu. Unlike many plants that bear fruit every year, rimu trees follow an unpredictable cycle known as masting. Some years they produce very little fruit. Then, after several years, entire forests suddenly become covered with an enormous abundance of berries. At first, scientists thought this was merely a coincidence. But as more years of data accumulated, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly every major breeding season for the kākāpō matched a mast year. When the rimu trees produced abundant fruit, females became far more likely to nest. When the trees remained quiet, breeding almost disappeared. It was one of the most important discoveries in the history of the recovery program. For millions of years, the kākāpō had evolved to reproduce only when nature provided enough food to raise chicks successfully. The rich fruit of the rimu tree supplied mothers with the energy needed to lay eggs and care for young birds during the long nesting period. Artificial food, no matter how nutritious it seemed, could not fully replace this ancient ecological relationship. Conservationists realized they had been trying to persuade the birds to breed on a human schedule. The kākāpōs were following nature's schedule instead. Once researchers understood this connection, they changed their strategy. Instead of expecting annual breeding, they prepared intensively for mast years. Rangers monitored forests across the islands, watching the rimu trees closely. When heavy fruiting began, conservation teams knew an important breeding season was approaching. Extra nesting boxes were prepared. Additional staff arrived on the islands. Veterinarians remained on standby. Every possible resource was ready before the first eggs appeared. The results improved, but another unexpected problem soon emerged. Although more chicks were hatching, many of them were males. At first, this seemed like simple chance. However, as scientists examined the records, they noticed another surprising pattern. During years when females received very large amounts of supplemental food, the proportion of male chicks increased significantly. This presented a serious challenge. A healthy population needs both males and females. Too many males meant fewer future mothers, slowing recovery even further. Researchers investigated the phenomenon and discovered it reflected a natural biological strategy seen in several animal species. When mothers experience exceptionally favorable conditions, they may be more likely to produce the larger, more energy-demanding sex. In kākāpōs, males grow considerably larger than females and require greater investment during development. Ironically, by providing unlimited food, conservationists may have unintentionally encouraged females to produce more sons than daughters. The solution required remarkable precision. Instead of offering as much supplemental food as possible, rangers carefully adjusted feeding programs to resemble natural conditions more closely. The birds still received enough nutrition to remain healthy, but not so much that it dramatically altered their reproductive patterns. Over time, the balance between male and female chicks improved. It was another reminder that conservation is rarely as simple as providing safety and food. Every species carries millions of years of evolutionary history. Even the best intentions must respect those ancient biological systems. As the population slowly grew, scientists faced yet another challenge. With so few surviving ancestors, every kākāpō alive was closely related to many others. The danger was no longer predators. It was genetics. Without careful management, future generations could suffer from increasing inbreeding, reduced fertility, and greater vulnerability to disease. Saving the Kakapō would now require tools that earlier generations of conservationists could never have imagined. Technology, genetics, and decades of scientific research were about to become just as important as the forests themselves. By the early 2000s, the Kakapō recovery program had achieved something that once seemed impossible. The birds were safe from predators. Scientists understood the importance of remum mast years, and breeding success had begun to improve. But another challenge was becoming impossible to ignore. There simply weren't enough unrelated birds left. Every living Kakapō descended from a very small number of survivors. That meant each generation carried less genetic diversity than a healthy wild population would normally possess. Without enough genetic variation, harmful mutations can accumulate over time. Fertility may decline, and populations become more vulnerable to disease. For a species with only a few dozen individuals, genetics became just as important as habitat. The Department of Conservation began working closely with wildlife veterinarians, geneticists, and reproductive specialists. Every Kakapō was given its own identity, complete with detailed health records, family history, and genetic profile. Instead of managing the birds as a single flock, scientists monitored each individual as though every one represented an irreplaceable piece of a much larger puzzle. The information helped researchers decide which birds should breed whenever opportunities arose. In nature, animals choose their own mates. But when an entire species is on the brink of extinction, allowing chance alone to determine reproduction can become risky. Some birds were genetically overrepresented, while others carried rare DNA that conservationists hoped to preserve. To increase genetic diversity, wildlife experts introduced carefully managed artificial insemination. The procedure was performed only when necessary and always under strict veterinary supervision. By using genetic information to guide breeding, researchers could increase the chances that future chicks would inherit a broader range of healthy genes. It was one of the most advanced wildlife conservation programs ever attempted. Time, however, presented another obstacle. The breeding islands were covered with rugged forests, steep hills, and dense vegetation. Sometimes a female became ready to breed, while the most suitable male lived kilometers away across difficult terrain. Speed mattered. Biological samples cannot remain viable forever. To solve the problem, conservation teams adopted an unexpected piece of technology. Small drones began transporting carefully prepared reproductive samples across the islands in just minutes rather than the much longer journeys required on foot. What once demanded exhausting hikes through thick forest could now be completed quickly, giving scientists a far better chance of successful breeding. It was an extraordinary combination of modern engineering and wildlife conservation. Few people would have imagined that tiny aircraft could one day help save one of the world's rarest parrots. Technology also transformed how the birds were monitored. Each Kakapō wore a lightweight transmitter that allowed rangers to track its movements without disturbing its natural behavior. These devices recorded valuable information about activity patterns, nesting attempts, and health. If a bird remained unusually still for too long, conservation workers could investigate immediately. If a female entered a nesting burrow, rangers quietly installed cameras nearby to observe without interfering. Some nests were monitored around the clock. When chicks hatched, they were weighed regularly, examined by veterinarians, and carefully protected from illness during the most vulnerable weeks of life. Every successful chick represented years of planning. Yet even with all these advances, nature reminded everyone that recovery could never be taken for granted. In 2019, the program experienced one of its most difficult setbacks. Several Kakapos became infected with aspergillosis, a serious fungal disease capable of affecting birds' respiratory systems. Veterinary teams responded immediately, transporting sick birds to specialized facilities where they received intensive medical care. Some survived after weeks of treatment. Others could not be saved. The losses were heartbreaking. After decades of progress, conservationists were reminded that extinction remained a real possibility. But the response demonstrated how much the recovery program had evolved. Instead of accepting the outbreak as unavoidable, veterinarians, microbiologists, and wildlife specialists worked together to understand the disease, improve treatment methods, and strengthen future monitoring. Every setback became another lesson. Every lesson improved the chances of survival. Slowly, the population continued growing. From only 51 known birds in the mid-1990s, the number climbed past 100. Then it continued rising. For the first time in generations, the kākāpō was no longer disappearing. It was recovering. And after more than 3 decades of relentless work, New Zealand witnessed something conservationists had dreamed about for years. A breeding season unlike anything the program had ever seen. The results would leave scientists and bird lovers around the world deeply moved. When the final 51 kākāpōs were relocated to predator-free islands, conservationists knew they had bought the species another chance. What they did not know was whether that chance would be enough. Saving a species is very different from helping it recover. For years, progress came slowly. Each breeding season brought cautious optimism, followed by disappointment when only a handful of chicks survived. Every success demanded thousands of hours of work from scientists, veterinarians, pilots, rangers, volunteers, and indigenous Maori partners who shared a deep commitment to protecting one of New Zealand's most extraordinary native birds. Recovery became a marathon rather than a sprint. As the decades passed, each new generation of kākāpōs represented more than an increase in numbers. It proved that the species still possessed the ability to rebuild itself if given the right conditions. By the early 2020s, the population had grown far beyond what anyone had dared to hope during the darkest years of the program. Instead of only a few dozen birds, more than 200 kākāpōs were alive. Every individual remained carefully monitored, but the outlook had changed dramatically. Scientists were no longer asking whether the kākāpō would survive another year. They were beginning to ask what a truly self-sustaining future might look like. Then nature provided another remarkable opportunity. After several quiet years, forests on the southern islands experienced another strong Rimu mass season. Heavy crops of fruit covered the trees, creating exactly the environmental conditions that female kākāpōs had evolved to recognize for thousands of generations. Conservation teams immediately prepared for what they hoped would become an exceptional breeding year. Additional staff traveled to the islands. Nest monitoring systems were checked. Veterinary equipment was prepared. Every transmitter was tested. Rangers worked around the clock, knowing the coming months could become one of the most important chapters in the history of the recovery program. Their hopes were rewarded. Dozens of females built nests. Eggs appeared across multiple islands. Soon, healthy chicks began emerging from carefully protected burrows. Each successful hatch represented another victory over extinction. For the people who had dedicated much of their lives to these birds, the emotional impact was impossible to describe. Some rangers had spent decades walking the forests, checking nests in the middle of cold, rainy nights, and celebrating every single chick that survived. Now they were witnessing the strongest signs of recovery the species had experienced in modern history. The achievement belonged to countless people. Field biologists who tracked birds through dense forests. Veterinarians who treated injured and sick individuals. Geneticists who protected the remaining diversity of the population. Pilots who transported birds safely between islands. Volunteers who supported conservation work behind the scenes. And Maori communities whose cultural connection to the kākāpō stretches back centuries, continued playing an important role in protecting one of Aotearoa New Zealand's most treasured species. Yet conservationists remain realistic. The kākāpō is still classified as critically endangered. Every bird continues to matter. Climate change may alter the timing of Rimu fruiting seasons. Disease remains a constant threat. Because the population is still relatively small, maintaining healthy genetic diversity will require careful management for years to come. Recovery